going on, y'all? Welcome to Truth Be Joe. As promised, real soon we are going to have the information from Harris County for the Francis Newton case. Until that arrives, we got some more things we're going to dive into real quickly. Right now we're going to get into the Daniel Perry case. In case you don't know, Daniel Perry is the man who was convicted of killing somebody during the George Floyd protest. Originally, he said it was self-defense, and a lot of right-wingers and gun advocates are advocating for his release. So much so that Greg Abbott is actually going to pardon him before he's even been to prison. Now, he's in jail. He hasn't even been transported to prison yet. He hasn't even been sentenced. That's how bad this is. But what we're going to do is we're going to do fair and honestly, we're going to break down the facts. We're going to do this really, really briefly. So look, let's break down the facts. One of the biggest facts of this case is that Daniel Perry did not live in Austin. He lived in Lufkin or one of these areas that was about an hour and a half away from Austin. He went to Austin to do Uber. So that's one of the biggest facts of this. I think another really big determining factor in the jury's ideology of whether he was guilty or innocent is the fact that he drove to a crowd instead of not going towards a crowd. So I think that's substantially different than trying to avoid conflict, intentionally going to a conflict. Nobody came to him, he turned into a crowd. I think that made a big difference too. Now I think the biggest factor of this case is the fact that he posted a lot of hateful rhetoric about the protesters in the days prior to the shooting. I think the day of and the day before, he mentioned that he may have to shoot somebody. So I think that was kind of a big deal to the jury. Now, was this shooting legal? Now, we're going to break down the Texas State Law, Chapter 2, Section 9. I think it's Section 9.31. It says that if you honestly believe that your life is in danger, you do have a right to defend yourself by any means necessary, to include deadly force. Now, before we get into whether or not he was guilty or innocent of the crime, we always want to start, as a jury, with the presumption of innocence. In other words, we want to presume that what he said is true and he did feel like he was fearing for his life. It's up to the prosecution to prove that that was not the case. Now, the prosecution's theory is that he intentionally went down there to Austin with the intention of creating an altercation and hopefully shooting somebody. Now, they based this theory on some Facebook posts that he had made and some text messages that he had sent. Now, the argument was, should they even have allowed this into the case because it had nothing to do with the actual shooting. And in this case, it's kind of 50-50 because the whole purpose of going to court for these cases is to let the jury determine what the defendant was thinking at the time of the shooting. So whenever it comes to murder cases, whether you're going to be first degree murder, second degree, was it premeditated? So the jury has to almost get into the mind of the defendant. So all of these text messages and all of these Facebook posts and this hateful rhetoric had to be allowed in the court so that the jury can decipher whether this was self-defense or whether it was just him ready to shoot somebody for a long time. Now, the defense's theory on the case is very, very absurd, if you ask me, in my opinion. I think that's why they lost the case. So the defense theory on the case is that, well, I don't want to say the theory, but the defense is saying that the protesters were protesting. Perry drove into the protesters, not with his car, but he drove where the protesters were. He tried to get past the protesters with his car, even though they were clearly protesting. And one of the protesters had an AR-15 on his back, and it wasn't loaded. There's no way for him to know that. I will concur. Now, he said that the guy did not point the gun at him, but he thought, hey, this guy has a gun. He's a protester. He could possibly have his gun pointed at me any second now, so let me shoot him. That's their theory. That's their defense. They're saying that the only reason why I shot because he had a gun and he looked like he might want to point it at me at some point in time. So I went on ahead and offed him before he had an opportunity to do so. I think that's a horrible defense. I think it's outrageously stupid, dumb. But the bad part about this defense is that all the eyewitnesses were actually protesters. So you really couldn't get anything good for the defense from the eyewitnesses because they were all technically on the other side. So the theory on their ideology of how to defend this case, I thought was stupid, and I did not think it worked with the jury. Now, before I get my conclusion on this case, I want to preface it by saying that I am not anti-gun. I do believe that people have an unalienable right to defend themselves by any means necessary, if it includes deadly force. I want to make that clear. On this in particular case, I think that we always have to keep the paradigm set, and we have to make sure that we don't allow people to kill others under the guise of self-defense. I think that this Daniel Perry went to Austin looking for protesters. I think that he knew for a fact that there were protesters there when he made that turn. I think that he was hoping that somebody said something or did something because his intent was to shoot somebody. By the text messages and the Facebook posts, that leads me to believe that his intent was to go and shoot somebody. He did it under the guise of self-defense. I'm not anti-gun. I'm not anti-self-defense. I'm very pro. I'm Malcolm X, not Martin Luther King. I believe that you have a right to defend yourself by any means necessary. But at the same time, I think we need to always set a paradigm. Do we want people just to be able to go to somebody they don't like and say, oh, well, he threatened me, he had a gun? Everybody has a gun. This is Texas. Everybody has a gun. It's an open carry state. You go to Whataburger, half the people in the building got a gun. So that's not an excuse to shoot nobody. I'm Joe, and this is Truth Be Joe.